Dr. Samuel Wright was sitting in his office, everything was as usual. He had no idea this day would change his life. But when the door opened, and two black twins entered the room, one of them said, "You're our father." The doctor froze. What does this mean? Who are these people? How would you react in the doctor's place? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to find out how it all ends. Dr. Samuel Wright sat in his office, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead accompanying his usual routine. It was an ordinary day, much like the hundreds before it. He was a man of habit, his career as a renowned specialist in internal medicine was stable, his reputation impeccable, and his life orderly. Everything in his world had its place, neatly filed away, carefully structured. But that day, as the clock ticked forward, he had no idea that the carefully constructed world he knew was about to shatter. The door to his office creaked open, and two figures entered. At first glance, they appeared to be just another pair of patients, perhaps a couple or a pair of siblings. But then the door closed softly behind them, and everything changed. Dr. Wright glanced up, offering his usual polite, practiced smile, ready to engage in the casual pleasantries that often accompanied a first meeting with new patients. What he saw, however, caused him to freeze. Standing before him were two young men, twins, both dressed in simple, but neat clothes. They were strikingly similar in appearance, though one had slightly more prominent features than the other. The more dominant twin stood a little taller, his posture slightly more commanding, while his brother was a touch more reserved, his gaze focused downward. But it wasn't their appearance that made Dr. Wright's heart skip a beat. It was the intense look in their eyes, something both vulnerable and unsettling. Dr. Wright's mind raced for a moment. He had seen all kinds of people in his career, from the anxious to the confident, but these two seemed out of place. They weren't here for the typical consultation. There was something different about them, an energy that didn't belong in this office, a tension hanging in the air. The silence lingered for a heartbeat too long before the taller twin spoke, his voice steady but filled with an emotion that Dr. Wright couldn't place. "You are our father," the twin said, the words hanging in the air, thick with the weight of truth. The word struck Dr. Wright like a slap, knocking the wind out of him. His smile faltered, and he blinked in disbelief, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. He searched their faces, looking for any hint of jest or sarcasm, but found none. Instead, their expressions were serious, unwavering, as though they had come to deliver a message he couldn't ignore. "You are our father," the other twin repeated, his voice quieter, but the sincerity was no less piercing. The room seemed to tilt slightly. The air grew thick, and Dr. Wright found himself unable to respond. His mind scrambled for a rational explanation, something that could justify this absurd statement, but none came. He had no memory of them, these young men who were now standing before him, declaring an unimaginable truth. The twins didn't wait for him to speak. They were clearly prepared for the shock. The more dominant twin took a small step forward, pulling out a crumpled, yellowed envelope from his coat pocket. He handed it to Dr. Wright, who accepted it mechanically, still trying to process the enormity of what was unfolding. Inside the envelope was a photograph that felt too familiar and yet completely alien at the same time. It was a picture of Dr. Wright in his youth, smiling in a way he hadn't in years. His younger self looked carefree, unaware of the storm that was about to rise. The photograph was old, weathered, the edges curled from time and handling. And scrawled across the bottom of the photo, in elegant handwriting, were the words, "You are their father." Dr. Wright's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced. He had to have misunderstood. This was some sort of cruel joke, a bizarre misunderstanding. He looked up at the twins, searching for a sign that this was all just an illusion, but all he saw were their faces, faces he had never seen before, yet somehow felt strangely familiar. The moment stretched on, his thoughts scattered, as he tried to comprehend what they had just said. Could it be possible? Was it really true? He tried to recall the last time he had even been in a situation like this, a relationship, a night spent with someone, a possible connection. But nothing came to him. The last decade of his life had been carefully compartmentalized into work, responsibilities, and the rigid structure of a professional existence. He had no room for the unknown, for anything that didn't fit neatly into his carefully built life. And yet, here they were, telling him that he was their father. As the silence in the room grew heavier, Dr. Wright finally found his voice, though it was shaky and uncertain. This can't be possible," he muttered to himself, more than to them. I don't even know you." The twins exchanged a glance, one of understanding, as though they had anticipated his disbelief. The dominant twin spoke again, his tone gentler this time. "We know this is hard to believe, but it's the truth," he said. "And we're here to make you understand." Dr. Wright sat back in his chair, numbness creeping through him as he realized the depth of the situation. His world, once so stable, was now teetering on the edge of an unimaginable revelation. As the twins began to explain the story behind their mother's death and the reasons they had kept their identity a secret for so long, Dr. Wright's mind struggled to process their words. What had happened to lead to this moment? And more importantly, what would he do now that his life had been irrevocably changed? The ordinary had turned into the extraordinary, and Dr. Wright was about to discover just how deep the truth ran, a truth that would shake the very foundations of his world. The silence in Dr. Samuel Wright's office seemed to stretch indefinitely, as the twins stood before him, their expressions unwavering. The weight of their earlier words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "You are our father." Despite the shock and confusion that clouded his mind, Dr. Wright felt his heart pounding as he stared at the crumpled envelope in his hands. The photograph of his younger self lay heavy in his lap, and now, the twins were waiting for him to process their revelation. Their eyes never left him, as if this moment had been years in the making, and they were determined to see it through. They gave him no room for escape, no option to deny the truth, not even the slightest sign of doubt. It was as though the universe had conspired to force him into this reality, and they were merely the messengers. Still, Dr. Wright could barely breathe. His fingers, trembling with disbelief, slid open the yellowed envelope. He could feel the years of neglect and time pressing against him as he pulled out the letter. It was fragile, the paper thin and worn from what seemed like years of handling. It looked like a relic from the past, a letter that had traveled a long, painful journey to reach him. The twins stood silently, watching as he unfolded it carefully. Each movement felt deliberate, as if the letter itself held the power to change everything, and Dr. Wright couldn't afford to rush it. He feared that if he moved too quickly, he might break the fragile bond it represented. The letter was written in neat, elegant handwriting, the kind that belonged to a woman with grace and intelligence, someone who had chosen her words carefully. Dr. Wright's eyes scanned the page, his breath shallow as he began to read. "To the father of my children. I hope this letter finds you well. If you are reading this, it means that I am no longer here to explain things to you myself, and I can only hope you will understand the reasons behind my silence. You may not remember me, but I remember you. I remember the time we spent together, the way you looked at me, the way your presence felt so safe. I remember how you were kind, gentle, and so very different from the world that often tried to judge me for what I looked like. I don't expect you to forgive me for what I'm about to ask. In fact, I know that you may never be able to forgive me. But I am asking you, now that I am gone, to accept the truth. The children who stand before you are yours. I am their mother, and I have kept this secret for so long because I feared for their future. You see, the world we live in is not kind to those who do not fit neatly into its norms. And I knew that the moment anyone learned that you, an esteemed doctor, had children with me, a woman of my skin color, it would cost you everything. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let them take away the life you had built. But now, as I lie here, dying, I realize that keeping this secret any longer would be a betrayal to my children. They deserve to know the truth. And so, I am telling you now, with all the love I have for them, that they are yours. I only wish I could have told you sooner. I hope, somehow, you can find it in your heart to be the father they need. Forever yours. Lydia. Dr. Wright's hands trembled as he lowered the letter, his eyes still locked on the words. The name, Lydia, echoed in his mind, and for a moment, he was transported back in time. He could almost hear her voice, the warmth of her laughter, the way she made him feel like he was truly seen for the first time. He hadn't thought of her in years, not since she had left, the day she walked out of his life without a word, without an explanation. He had believed it was his career that had driven her away, his work, his ambitions, the rigid nature of his professional life. But this letter revealed a different truth. It wasn't just about his job, it was about fear of a society that was so blinded by its own prejudices that it would have destroyed everything he had worked for, everything they had built together. Fear that their children, his children, would have to pay the price for something they had no control over. The letter felt like a final confession, an apology, a plea for redemption. But it also held a kind of bitterness, a deep sorrow, as if Lydia had known that the truth would hurt. Dr. Wright could feel the weight of her decision, the burden she had carried alone for so many years. She had kept this secret, had borne it silently, out of love for him, or perhaps out of fear that he would reject her, reject them. Dr. Wright glanced up at the twins, their faces a mixture of expectation and quiet desperation. They were waiting for him to understand, to accept what had been hidden for so long. But how could he? How could he reconcile this with the life he had lived, the man he had become? His mind raced, but his heart was still in turmoil, caught between the past and the present, between his own understanding of who he was and the father he was supposed to be. The room felt smaller now, suffocating with the weight of the truth. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't walk away from it. The reality was too real, too raw. Lydia had gone, but her words, her love for their children, had been left behind. And now, those children were here, standing before him, looking at him with eyes full of hope. Dr. Wright had no choice but to face the truth. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breath. The world he had built, the life he had fought for, seemed to crumble before him. And yet, somewhere deep inside, he knew that he had no other choice but to face what Lydia had left him, what his children had come to claim. It was time to face the past and the future that had always been just beyond his reach. As Dr. Samuel Wright sat motionless, still clutching the fragile letter from Lydia, his mind drifted back to a time long past, a time that now felt like a distant dream, barely within his grasp. The room around him seemed to blur, as though the walls had dissolved and only the hazy echoes of his memories remained. He could almost hear her laughter, soft and melodic, lingering in the corners of his mind. Lydia. She had been everything he hadn't known he was missing. Their love had been effortless, the kind of rare connection that seemed to be woven from the very fabric of destiny. When they first met, it had been at a medical conference, the kind of event where professionals gathered to exchange knowledge, but also to exchange pleasantries and ideas. Dr. Wright had been a rising star in the field of medicine, respected for his brilliance but perhaps a little too absorbed in his work. Lydia had been different from anyone he had met before. She was a nurse, compassionate and intuitive in ways that often left him in awe. She saw the world not just as it was, but as it could be. Her eyes, dark and full of unspoken stories, had captivated him from the moment their gazes met. Their first conversation had been brief, just a few words exchanged over coffee, but it had felt like the start of something powerful. He'd been struck by her presence, the way she carried herself with such quiet strength, her soft-spoken voice carrying the weight of experience. As their paths crossed more often, they found themselves drawn together, and soon, their professional encounters turned into personal ones. It wasn't long before they were inseparable. The days spent with Lydia were the happiest Dr. Wright could recall. Her laughter had been a balm to his soul, her touch a comfort he hadn't realized he craved. They had shared countless evenings together, walking through the quiet streets of the city, talking about everything and nothing at all. He had never felt more alive, more seen. She made him feel as though the world was bigger than the sterile, clinical world he lived in, as if life had depth beyond the white walls of the hospitals and the crowded conferences. She taught him to appreciate the moments in between, the pauses that so often went unnoticed. But as deeply as he had loved her, Dr. Wright also knew that their relationship was not without challenges. There had always been a subtle tension, something unspoken between them, an awareness that they came from different worlds. He was a man of status, a respected professional, a member of a society that often measured worth by the color of one's skin. She, on the other hand, had grown up in a world that demanded resilience in the face of prejudice. Lydia was black, and Dr. Wright was white. Though they never spoke of it directly, there was an understanding that their love was not a simple one. It was only when Lydia discovered she was pregnant that the true weight of their differences began to surface. At first, the news had been joyous. They had spoken of the future with hope, imagining what their life together would be like, their child a blend of their love, of their different backgrounds, a beautiful union of two people from two worlds. But when the reality of it sank in, so did the fear. Lydia had always known the risks they faced, the way society might judge them, the way the world might turn against their child. And, more than that, she had known that the consequences of their relationship would extend beyond them. She could see it more clearly than Dr. Wright could at the time. She had spent her life navigating a world that was unforgiving to those who did not fit in its prescribed boxes. She had faced the weight of racism before, subtle slights, direct insults, the kind of quiet exclusion that seeped into every interaction. But for her, it was a familiar burden, one she had learned to carry with dignity. When she discovered that their child would be black, the reality hit her in a way Dr. Wright had not anticipated. She knew that the world, in all its cruelty, would never allow them to live in peace. Their child, their love, would always be viewed through a lens of prejudice. She feared that the moment their child was born, the world would take everything from them, everything Dr. Wright had worked so hard to build. The job he loved, the respect he had earned, the life he had fought for. All of it would be at risk. She feared that, no matter how hard they tried, the world would never accept them. The night Lydia left had been a blur of confusion and heartbreak. Dr. Wright had begged her to stay, tried to reassure her that they would face it together. But Lydia, ever pragmatic, had seen the truth of their situation more clearly than he could. She told him, with quiet resignation, that she couldn't be the one to destroy everything he had worked for. She couldn't be the reason that his career, his life, was torn apart by the cruelty of others. She left him with no anger, no bitterness, just an overwhelming sadness, an understanding that love alone wasn't enough to break the chains that society had placed around them. The last words they exchanged before she disappeared into the night had haunted him ever since. "I love you, but I can't put you through this. I can't ask you to give up everything for me, for us." And then she was gone. The finality of it hit him like a physical blow. He couldn't grasp what had happened, couldn't understand why she had left without a word, without a fight. But now, looking back, he understood. She had left because of the world, not because of him. The memory of her departure was still raw, a jagged wound in his heart that never fully healed. He had spent years burying the pain, focusing on his work, convincing himself that he was better off without her. But now, as he sat in his office, holding the letter from Lydia, the truth of it all came crashing down. She had loved him enough to walk away, enough to shield him from a world that would never understand their love. And now, her children, his children, stood before him, forcing him to confront everything he had denied for so long. His life had been built on the illusion of control, of safety, but Lydia had known all along that the world didn't work that way. She had known that their love would never be enough to protect them from the ugliness of racism, of a society that saw only what was on the outside. Dr. Wright sat back in his chair, the weight of his memories pressing down on him. The woman he had loved, the woman who had loved him in return, had been right all along. The world was not kind. But it was her love, and her sacrifice, that had given him the greatest gift he could never have anticipated, the chance to finally see the truth of his own heart. The days following the arrival of the letter felt like an endless cascade of confusion and disbelief for Dr. Samuel Wright. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, as if he were walking through a fog, uncertain of which direction to follow. The twins, his children, had come into his life like a storm, and the revelation that he was their father had thrown everything he thought he knew into question. Despite the initial shock, there was one thing that remained undeniable: the letter. Lydia's words had been clear, her request for him to acknowledge the truth, and her plea for him to accept their children, was now his burden to bear. But Dr. Wright couldn't simply take her word for it. As much as he wanted to believe the truth in front of him, as much as the image of the photograph and the letter clawed at his heart, there was a part of him that refused to let go of the familiar structure of reason. His life had been built on facts, on science, on the certainty that logic could explain everything, that is, except the inexplicable appearance of two strangers at his door, claiming to be his offspring. The decision was inevitable. He couldn't deny the weight of their words, the sincerity in their eyes, but he needed proof. It was the only way he could move forward. He called the twins back to his office a week later, still shaken, still unsure of what to expect, but with a firm resolve in his mind. They agreed without hesitation, their quiet confidence remaining unshaken. They had known this moment would come. They had come prepared. Dr. Wright had arranged for a discreet DNA test at a lab he trusted, a facility that prided itself on confidentiality and professionalism. He wasn't worried about the accuracy of the results. His career had taught him the value of science, of evidence. But nothing could prepare him for the emotional weight of what the test would reveal. When the results came back, Dr. Wright was alone in his office. He held the envelope in his hands, the thick paper crackling faintly under his fingertips as he stared at the words on the outside: confidential results. The moment felt surreal, like he was suspended between two worlds, the world he had always known, with its structure and predictability, and this new world that seemed to have no rules, where his very identity had been questioned. He ripped the envelope open slowly, almost reverently, not knowing if he wanted to confirm the truth or deny it. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper. His eyes immediately scanned the top, the bold letters spelling out what he feared and simultaneously knew was coming: paternity test results, 100% positive match. He froze. His pulse quickened, and the room around him seemed to close in. The words blurred for a moment as his mind raced. This can't be real, he thought. I must be reading it wrong. But when he blinked and refocused his eyes, the words remained unchanged. He looked at the test again, scanning the figures, the markers, and the data. It was irrefutable. The twins were his children. His head swam with a whirlwind of emotions. Shock was the first to settle in, followed by disbelief, and then a strange, suffocating sense of guilt. How could I have been so blind? He wondered. The twins were a part of him, a part of the woman he had loved, and yet he had been so disconnected, so absorbed in his own life and career that he had never even known they existed. He had never even imagined that he might be a father. The irony of it all was almost unbearable. He had always prided himself on being a man of facts, a man who based his life on precision and certainty. But here, now, was something that no amount of knowledge or experience could have prepared him for: the undeniable, biological truth that these two young men were his sons. His children, whom he had never known, had been walking this earth for years, and he had missed it all. The grief that followed was profound. He had been so caught up in the constraints of his profession, so consumed by the world he had built, that he had never given space for something as raw, as unpredictable, as love, and now, in the form of these two strangers, it had arrived at his doorstep. Dr. Wright stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor, and walked to the window. He needed air. He needed space to think, to process this new, overwhelming reality. The city outside appeared as it always had, calm, orderly, predictable. But inside him, the ground had shifted. His world had been irrevocably altered. How did Lydia do it? He wondered. How did she hide this from me? The thought of her, of everything she had kept hidden, of the burden she had carried for all these years, filled him with an aching sorrow. She had been right to leave him, to protect him from the cruelty of a society that would never understand their love, never accept their children. But now, the consequences of her choices were no longer just hers to bear. They were his. The door to his office creaked open, and Dr. Wright turned to see the twins standing in the doorway, their eyes still full of quiet expectation. They had known, of course. They had always known the truth. But now, seeing it in writing, seeing the undeniable evidence, was a different kind of confirmation. They didn't need to speak, their presence was enough. Dr. Wright walked over to them, the weight of the test results still heavy in his hands. For a moment, he simply looked at them, his heart caught between love, guilt, and disbelief. These are my sons. The thought hit him like a tidal wave. The same blood flowed through their veins, the same flesh and bone that had once been his own, and he had never even known they existed. He handed them the results, his hands trembling. They didn't need words now. The truth was undeniable. This was real. They were his family. And for the first time in his life, Dr. Wright realized that no amount of success or professional accolades could ever compare to the simple, unshakable truth of what stood before him: two children, his children, whom he had never known but would now have to learn to love. Dr. Samuel Wright leaned against the edge of his desk, the weight of the DNA results still pressing on him. His mind reeled with the implications of the past few days. He had learned that the two men standing in his office were his children, but that was only the beginning of a far more complicated story. The letter from Lydia had shattered his understanding of his life and his relationships. She had left him, and for years, he had believed it was because their love wasn't enough, because his career, his ambitions, had driven her away. But now, looking at the twins in front of him, there was a dawning realization that twisted his gut. He had never truly understood why Lydia had disappeared so suddenly, so completely. She had walked out of his life without a word, without an explanation. He had always assumed that she had grown tired of him, or perhaps that their love had burned too brightly, too quickly. But the truth, the full truth, was much darker than he could have ever imagined. As Dr. Wright stood there, his eyes scanning the faces of his children, a sickening clarity began to creep into his mind. Lydia had known something that he had refused to see. She had known that their love would never be enough to protect them, that the world they lived in would never accept them. She had known that the moment their child was born, the moment they brought a black child into this world, a child with his blood and hers, the consequences would be devastating. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for could be torn apart. Lydia had been right, but Dr. Wright had never seen it. He had been so absorbed in his success, so consumed by the rigid expectations of his professional world, that he had never considered how the world would view them. How the world would view her, a dark-skinned woman, and him, a light-skinned man, coming together in an intimate, unprotected bond. And how society would view the child, their child, born from that love. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Lydia had left because she loved him too much to let him sacrifice everything. She had known, deep down, that he could never survive the fallout of a scandal, not in the world they lived in. His work at the prestigious hospital, his position in the medical community, would have been questioned, scrutinized. People would have whispered behind his back, and worse, some might have tried to make his life so unbearable that he would be forced to resign, his reputation shattered by the simple fact of his family. She couldn't let that happen to him. She wouldn't allow it. Lydia had been forced to make a decision no one should ever have to make. She had to choose between love and survival. Between keeping the man she loved and preserving his career, his future. And so, she had chosen for both of them. She had disappeared, taking their child with her, hiding the truth, from him, from the world. And for years, Dr. Wright had lived in ignorance, believing that the loss of Lydia had been a result of his workaholic nature, that she had simply walked away because he was too focused on his career. But it wasn't just that. It was the crushing weight of racial prejudice that had driven her to leave. She had understood that the world would never accept their child. She had known that their son or daughter would face a life of hardship, a life of being seen as other, a life where the color of their skin would overshadow everything else. And worse, she had known that he, a respected doctor, would have been branded as a traitor to his own kind, as someone who had chosen to father a child with a woman outside of his race. The consequences of that, both for him personally and professionally, would have been catastrophic. Dr. Wright had never understood that his career, his position in the world, had always been fragile, teetering on the edge of societal expectations. Lydia had made a decision that, at the time, seemed incomprehensible to him. She had left because of him. Because of them. Because the love they had shared could never withstand the harsh glare of judgment that society would cast on them. It was a cruel irony that he had never truly realized until now. As he looked at the twins standing before him, their faces still expectant, their patience never wavering, Dr. Wright's heart ached. They were his children. They had been his children all along, and yet he had never been there to protect them. They had grown up without him, without the father who had always been too absorbed in his own life to understand the weight of their mother's sacrifice. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat threatening to choke him. How could I have been so blind? The guilt was overwhelming. Lydia had given up her life with him, sacrificed their family, and raised their children alone, all because she feared for their future. Because she knew that society would never accept them. And yet, he had never once questioned why she had left. I didn't understand, Dr. Wright muttered, his voice thick with emotion. I thought you left because of me. Because of my work, my focus on my career. The taller twin stepped forward, his expression softening. It wasn't just your career, Dr. Wright, he said quietly. It was everything. It was the world we live in. It was the fact that our mother knew, deep down, that we would never be accepted for who we are, not by society, not by the people you work with. The words cut through Dr. Wright like a blade. Of course, he thought. Of course she knew. She had been trying to protect them, protect him, by walking away. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of her sacrifice. Lydia had chosen to carry the burden of that decision alone. She had borne the pain of raising their children without the support of their father, knowing that the moment they entered the world, everything would change. And now, standing in front of him, were the children she had protected. His children. The twins. Dr. Wright opened his eyes, meeting their gaze for the first time without the shield of disbelief. It was time to acknowledge the truth. Time to stop hiding behind his career, behind his professional accomplishments. He had lost so much already, but in front of him stood a future he had never imagined. The future Lydia had protected all those years. And now, it was time for him to step into that future. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights in Dr. Samuel Wright's office felt oppressive now, as though the very air in the room had grown thick with the weight of unspoken truths. He sat back in his chair, staring at the twins before him, their presence in the room both grounding and unsettling. They were his children. The undeniable truth of that fact still reverberated in his mind, but as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the true magnitude of Lydia's actions became clear. She had hidden them from him, concealed their existence from a man who had once been the love of her life. She had done it out of love, yes, but also out of fear. Fear for them. Fear for him. Fear of a world that would never accept them, a world that would never accept their mixed heritage, that would never see their love as anything but an affront to the status quo. Lydia had known something that Dr. Wright hadn't. She had understood the depths of the society they lived in, a society that, despite all its progress, was still plagued by deep, ingrained racism. It wasn't just the hatred that people carried in their hearts. It was the quiet, insidious bias that ran through every institution, every corner of life. It was the way people would look at her, at him, at their children, and see something other, something wrong. It was in the way the medical community would respond. Lydia had known, deep down, that the moment it became known that a respected white doctor had fathered black children, everything would change. He could lose his job. He could lose his career. His name, a name that had been synonymous with respect, with success, could be dragged through the mud. His colleagues would question his competence, his judgment. The whispers would begin. And in the rarefied world he inhabited, that was all it would take to unravel everything. Dr. Wright felt his chest tighten as he thought back to the very beginning of his career. He had worked so hard to get where he was. He had sacrificed so much, his time, his relationships, his personal life, to climb the ladder of success. He had been the golden child of his field, a rising star whose every move was watched, whose every accomplishment was celebrated. His colleagues admired him, his superiors respected him, and the patients he treated trusted him with their lives. But in that world, where everything had to be perfect, everything had to be spotless, one mistake, one imperfection, could ruin everything. And for Lydia, the possibility of their children becoming a part of his life had felt like a ticking time bomb, a threat not just to their future, but to his. She had feared for his career, but it was more than that. It was about protecting him from a system that could, and would, tear him apart for the smallest transgression. His success had been built on a foundation of conformity, of fitting neatly into the mold that society had crafted for him. He was a well-spoken, well-dressed, highly educated man, everything the world expected of a doctor. But the world would never accept the children of a black woman and a white man. No matter how much he tried to prove that he was beyond the divisions of race, the world would see him as a man who had broken the unspoken rules. And the consequences would be swift. As he sat there, his mind racing, Dr. Wright couldn't help but think of all the subtle, everyday biases he had never really noticed before. He had been so consumed with his work, so focused on his own path, that he had failed to see the small ways in which race shaped every aspect of his life. The subtle glances, the undercurrent of judgment that lingered in the air when he interacted with people outside his professional sphere. He had been insulated, protected by his position, his reputation, his education. But Lydia had lived in the real world, a world where people of color were always aware of the spaces they occupied, the way they were seen. She had known that if their children were born, if the truth came out, it wouldn't matter how much he loved them. It wouldn't matter that he had built a life of integrity and care. All that would matter was the color of their skin. All that would matter was that they were different. And in a society where difference was still a threat, that difference could be used to destroy everything he had built. The more Dr. Wright thought about it, the more it became clear. Lydia hadn't just left to protect herself or to protect their children. She had left to protect him. To shield him from a world that would have torn him apart, and to shield their children from a lifetime of rejection, of hurt, of being seen as inferior. She had known the dangers of bringing a black child into this world, a world where racial prejudice was so deeply embedded that even his reputation, even his profession, couldn't protect them. The anger that welled up inside Dr. Wright was a fierce, searing thing. How could I have been so blind? He thought. How could I have been so consumed by my own career, by my own image, that I failed to see the world she was trying to protect me from? His mind raced with images of the years he had spent in oblivion, unaware of the sacrifice Lydia had made. The long hours he had worked, the patients he had seen, the accolades he had received, all of it had been meaningless, hollow, in the face of the truth that Lydia had kept hidden. She had made a choice to protect him, but in doing so, she had taken on the pain of raising their children alone. She had given them a life without their father, without the love and protection he could have offered. And for what? So that he could continue to live in the delusion that he was untouched by the biases of the world. Dr. Wright could feel the shame wash over him, the weight of his ignorance pressing down on him. He had failed to see the full scope of Lydia's love. She had loved him enough to let him go. To let him keep his career, his reputation, his life. And in doing so, she had sacrificed everything, including the family they could have had. The room felt suffocating as the realization settled in. Lydia had hidden the truth, hidden their children, not because she had wanted to, but because she had known that society would never allow them to live in peace. And now, as he sat here, confronted with the reality of his children, he understood just how far that fear had reached. The fear and bias that had kept them apart for so long was not just an abstract concept. It was real. It was visceral. And it had shaped their lives in ways that Dr. Wright could no longer ignore. As he looked at the twins again, their faces now a mix of uncertainty and hope, Dr. Wright knew that he had to make a choice. He could no longer hide behind the safety of his career, his reputation. He had to confront the world, and himself, for what he had allowed to happen. He had to face the fear and bias that had kept him from being the father they needed, the father he had always been. Dr. Samuel Wright sat in the quiet of his office, his fingers still gripping the edges of his desk as if they were the only anchor in a sea of confusion. His mind churned with the revelations of the past few days, each one layering upon the next, slowly suffocating the man he had once been. His life had been built on the foundation of his medical career, on his reputation and his ability to make a difference. He had always believed that his success was a result of his hard work, intelligence, and dedication. But now, as he reflected on the deeper truths that had emerged about his past, about Lydia, their children, and the world he had been so blind to, he realized how fragile that world had always been. Lydia's departure, once a puzzle he could never quite solve, now had a clarity that felt almost suffocating. She hadn't just left him for personal reasons or because of their strained relationship. She had left because the harsh reality of their society, a society riddled with prejudice and unspoken rules, made it impossible for them to have the life they deserved. She had left because the color of their children's skin would have marked them, branded them as outcasts in a world that still viewed race as a dividing line, an insurmountable barrier. It wasn't just about her fears for their future. It was about the deeply ingrained injustice that permeated every level of society, the systemic racism that was so pervasive, so embedded in the fabric of everyday life, that it would have stripped them of everything they held dear. The truth of it was devastating. Dr. Wright had always thought he had risen above such things. He had prided himself on his education, his accomplishments, his place in the world. He had convinced himself that his success meant that he was immune to the biases others faced, that his ability to excel had somehow made him less vulnerable to the prejudices that lingered in the shadows. But Lydia had understood something he hadn't. She had understood that no matter how successful he became, no matter how much respect he earned, he would always be viewed through the lens of his race. His identity as a white man, no matter how much he tried to distance himself from it, would always overshadow the love he had for her, for their children. And in a society that still clung to outdated notions of racial superiority, that love would never be enough to shield them from the harsh realities of discrimination. He thought back to the countless subtle moments he had experienced throughout his life, the times when he had been given the benefit of the doubt simply because of the color of his skin, the doors that had opened for him without question. As a child, as a student, and later as a professional, he had never once felt the weight of being judged based on something so arbitrary as race. He had been shielded from it, by his privilege, by his position in the world. But Lydia had never had that luxury. She had known from the very beginning that their love would not be accepted, not by the world they inhabited, not by the systems that governed it. Lydia had made a choice, one that tore her apart. She had chosen to protect their children from the pain she knew they would face. She had chosen to leave him, to shield him from the fallout of a society that could not tolerate their union. In doing so, she had sacrificed everything, including the future they could have had together. She had given up her own happiness, her own dreams, to save him from the scorn, the judgment, the possible ruin that would come from being associated with her, with their children. And the depth of that sacrifice was something Dr. Wright could no longer ignore. His heart ached with the weight of her decision. It wasn't just the personal cost of their love that he had failed to understand. It was the larger, more insidious impact of the world's prejudice. He had thought he was a man of reason, of science, someone who saw the world in black and white terms. But now he understood that there were forces at play that no amount of intellect, no amount of achievement, could change. Prejudice didn't just live in the hearts of individuals. It lived in the systems that governed their lives, in the unspoken rules that shaped their professions, their communities, and their future. Dr. Wright had spent years working in a field that prided itself on progress, on healing, on helping people. But he had never once stopped to think about the ways in which the very institutions he worked in were built on the exclusion of people like Lydia, people like his children. The medical profession, like so many others, had been complicit in perpetuating inequality. How many people had walked through the doors of the hospitals he had worked in, only to be judged, dismissed, or mistreated because of the color of their skin? How many had been denied the same opportunities, the same care, simply because they weren't given the benefit of the doubt? It was a harsh truth to confront, one that made him question everything he had ever believed about his own place in the world. He had always been proud of the work he did, of the respect he had earned. But now, standing on the precipice of this new understanding, he realized just how hollow that pride had been. The systems he had trusted, the institutions he had dedicated his life to, were built on the very biases that had driven Lydia to leave him. He looked at the twins again, their eyes full of questions, full of hope, but also full of a quiet sadness that only someone who had lived a life of being other could truly understand. They had grown up knowing the world's judgment, knowing the sting of exclusion, knowing that their very existence was a challenge to the status quo. And Dr. Wright had been absent from their lives, absent from their struggles, because he had been too focused on his own career, too comfortable in the protective bubble of his privilege to see the world for what it truly was. The injustice of it all felt suffocating. It wasn't just about race. It was about the systems that allowed prejudice to flourish unchecked. It was about the quiet, insidious ways that society reinforced those biases, making it nearly impossible for people like Lydia and their children to live without fear, without pain. The society they lived in wasn't just imperfect, it was broken. As the reality of Lydia's decision settled into his bones, Dr. Wright knew that he had to face this truth head-on. He could no longer hide behind the comfortable walls of his profession, behind the illusion of progress. He had to confront the injustice in society, the injustice that had shaped Lydia's life and the lives of his children. And, for the first time, he understood what it meant to truly fight for change, not just in the world of medicine, but in the world as a whole. It wasn't enough to be a good doctor. It wasn't enough to be a man of science. To make a real difference, to honor Lydia's sacrifice and the love they had shared, he had to fight for something more. He had to fight for a world where race didn't define a person's worth, where his children, their children, could live without fear, without prejudice, without the weight of injustice hanging over them. And that fight had to start with him. Dr. Samuel Wright had spent the better part of his life carefully constructing the man he believed he was. He had cultivated a reputation as a respected physician, a dedicated professional, a man whose skill and intellect were beyond question. He had believed that his accomplishments, the years spent studying, the sacrifices made for his career, the respect he had earned, were a testament to his own merit, his ability to rise above the limitations others might place on him. His identity was built on these pillars, solid and unshakable, or so he thought. But now, as he sat alone in his office, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him like a crushing tide, Dr. Wright felt something he hadn't anticipated: guilt. It seeped into every corner of his mind, coating his thoughts like a thick layer of dust he could no longer brush away. Guilt that he had never understood the true sacrifices Lydia had made for him. Guilt that he had failed to see how deeply the world's prejudice had shaped their lives, their love, and ultimately, their separation. The more he thought about it, the deeper the resentment sank. How could he have been so blind? How could he have spent so many years wrapped up in his own success, so absorbed in his professional life, that he had completely ignored the reality of the world Lydia and their children had lived in? He had been so focused on his own image, on his career, on building a life that was pristine and untouchable, that he had failed to see the quiet battles Lydia fought every single day. She had left him because of him. Because she had known, deep down, that he could never protect them from the world's gaze. He had been shielded by his privilege, by the walls of the institutions that had elevated him. He had never faced the kind of judgment that Lydia had faced simply for being a woman of color. And even worse, he had never once acknowledged that his success had come at the expense of their love, and of their family. The realization stung. He had always prided himself on being progressive, on seeing beyond the limitations of race, believing that his intelligence, his skills, would shield him from the societal judgments that plagued others. But now, looking back, he saw how naive he had been. His career, his comfortable, predictable life, had been built on the very systems that kept people like Lydia from ever finding peace. He had never questioned why he had been given so much. He had never considered why his life had been so easy, so free from the scrutiny that weighed down on others. Lydia had understood. She had always known that his career, his reputation, would be in jeopardy the moment their child was born. It wasn't just about her love for him, it was about the love she had for their children, the need to protect them from a world that would never accept them. She had known that the moment society saw their children, their lives would change. The whispers would start, the prejudice would surface, and the barriers would go up. She had known that the same world that had allowed Dr. Wright to climb the ranks without question would pull him down the moment his connection to her became public. His resentment flared as he realized just how deeply racism had destroyed not only his relationship with Lydia but his entire sense of self. He had spent his life blind to the realities of the world, shielded by his success, insulated by his privilege. He had failed to see the damage that prejudice could do, not just to individuals, but to entire families, entire lives. His mind turned back to the countless moments when he had heard casual, dismissive comments about race, overheard jokes in the halls of the hospital, seen the uncomfortable glances passed between colleagues when a patient of color came in for treatment. He had never taken those moments seriously, never questioned them. He had never thought about how those moments, those small, seemingly inconsequential actions, built the foundation for something far more insidious, the systemic racism that had allowed him to thrive while others struggled. He had been so deeply entrenched in his own world, in his own comfort, that he hadn't understood the toll it had taken on those around him. Lydia had always fought for her place in the world, fought to be seen for who she truly was, and yet he had been blind to it. He had dismissed her fears, her hesitations, thinking they were simply the fears of a woman in love. But now, he saw them for what they truly were, the stark reality of a woman who had lived her life in constant awareness of the prejudice that surrounded her. The guilt tightened in his chest as the full scope of his own failure hit him. He had failed to protect Lydia. He had failed to protect his children. He had failed to see how deeply racism had affected their lives, how it had shaped their choices, their actions, their very futures. His career had meant nothing compared to the lives they had lost, the family they could have been. But there was something even deeper gnawing at him now, something more personal. He wasn't just angry at the world for being unjust. He was angry at himself. He was angry at how easily he had allowed himself to be distracted, how quickly he had allowed his own ambitions to eclipse the love he had for Lydia, for his children. He had justified his neglect of their needs with the lie that he was doing it all for them, that his career would provide a better future. But in the end, it had been his career that had pushed them away. It had been his dedication to the image of a perfect, untouchable life that had forced Lydia to make the heartbreaking decision to leave. Dr. Wright rubbed his temples, the weight of his own failings suffocating him. He had to confront this, confront the fact that the very things he had built his life on had led him to this point. He had spent so much of his life focused on his reputation, his accomplishments, that he had never stopped to question the systems that allowed him to succeed. He had never stopped to wonder why he had been given such opportunities, why he had been shielded from the biases that crushed so many others. Now, as he looked at the twins, his children, the product of a love he had never fully understood, he realized that the guilt and resentment were not just his burden to bear. They were a reflection of the world he had allowed to exist, a world where people like Lydia and his children had to fight for their place. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about understanding that, as a doctor, as a man of privilege, he had a responsibility to change, to fight for a world where no one had to make the same sacrifices Lydia had made. A world where his children, their children, could walk into any room and never fear being judged by the color of their skin. The anger, the guilt, the resentment, it all had to fuel something more than just self-reflection. It had to fuel change. And Dr. Wright knew, deep in his heart, that the only way to make things right was to confront the very systems of prejudice that had shaped his life and the lives of those he loved. It was time to face the truth of who he was, and who he could be. The night was thick with the weight of all Dr. Samuel Wright had learned. His office, once a place of calm and certainty, now felt like a prison. The sterile white walls, the shelves of medical textbooks and journals that had once symbolized his intellectual triumphs, suddenly felt cold and distant. His life had been built on a foundation of scientific knowledge, years of training, research, and the trust of his colleagues and patients. But now, as he sat in the dim light of his office, those very achievements felt like a distant echo, fading into the background as the truth of his past consumed him. Dr. Wright leaned back in his chair, the pain of realization clawing at him. His thoughts kept returning to Lydia, to the woman he had once loved, the woman who had carried their children, hidden them from him, and ultimately, from the world. He had spent so long thinking she had left because of him, because of his career, his ambition, his inability to balance work with love. But now, he understood that it wasn't just about their relationship. It was about something far darker, something far more dangerous, the prejudice that coursed through the veins of society, and how it could destroy everything in its path. Lydia had kept their children hidden not because she had wanted to deceive him, but because she had known the world would never accept them. She had feared for their safety, for their very lives. The truth hit him like a sharp, unexpected blow. Lydia had protected their children from the consequences of his status, his career, and everything that came with it. His position as a well-known doctor, the respect he commanded in his field, the doors that were open to him because of his success, all of it could have become a weapon in the hands of those who would seek to destroy them. Dr. Wright had always believed that his professional achievements were a reflection of his ability, of his hard work and perseverance. But in this moment, he saw that his career, his privilege, had been a double-edged sword. Lydia had known that being a child of a prominent white doctor in a world still ruled by racism would put them at risk. His position would have been used against them. The moment their existence was known, the moment it became clear that their children were the product of an interracial relationship, society would have punished them. Lydia's decision to hide their children, to raise them without their father, had been one born of love, but also of survival. She had known that in the unforgiving world they lived in, their children would face a lifetime of discrimination, suspicion, and hate. She had feared that if Dr. Wright's colleagues, his peers in the medical world, the very people who had elevated him to his position, had found out about their children, his life, their lives, would have been destroyed. The whispers would start, the judgment would begin, and he would be pushed out of the very profession he had worked so hard to excel in. The realization struck him like a cold wave. How many times had he stood in front of a patient, making life-or-death decisions, believing that his work was immune to the biases that so many others faced? How many times had he walked through the hospital halls, comfortable in his status, unaware of the quiet racism that lurked just below the surface? He had believed that his career was proof of his merit, that his reputation would shield him from the world's ugliness. But Lydia had known the truth. No amount of success could protect them from the harm that prejudice could bring. She had seen the way people looked at her when they went out together. She had seen the glances exchanged behind her back, the way her presence in certain spaces made others uncomfortable. She had known that, in a world still steeped in racism, even love could be an enemy. Dr. Wright had never truly understood this until now. He had never seen the way Lydia carried that burden, the constant awareness of how their love would be judged, how their children would be viewed. The subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, hostility that would follow them wherever they went. Lydia's choice to keep their children hidden from him hadn't been made lightly. She hadn't done it out of bitterness or anger, but out of a desire to protect them from the dangers that society would impose upon them. She had known that their children, as much as they were a part of both of them, would never be seen as just children. They would always be seen as the product of a forbidden union, a union that society had no room for, a society that had no tolerance for the blending of races. The deep, visceral pain of understanding this truth settled in Dr. Wright's chest. He had lived a life insulated from the realities of racism. He had been shielded by his success, by his position. But Lydia had never had that luxury. She had known, every day, that the color of their children's skin would mark them in ways he could never fully understand. She had known that no matter how much love they shared, no matter how much he tried to support them, the world would never allow their children to be safe, to be free from the chains of prejudice. Dr. Wright closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his own ignorance, the weight of the privilege he had never questioned. He had believed that his career, his reputation, his ability to work in a respected field would protect him from the realities of racism. But Lydia had been right. The very things that had allowed him to thrive in his world, his whiteness, his success, were the same things that would have torn his family apart. As the truth settled in, Dr. Wright understood the depth of Lydia's love, the profound sacrifice she had made. She had kept their children from him, not because she didn't want him to be a part of their lives, but because she had feared the consequences of their existence. She had done it to protect them, to protect him, from a world that was unforgiving, that would never allow their love to be enough. The room seemed to close in on him, the air thick with the realization that the world he had taken for granted was far from perfect, far from just. And in that moment, Dr. Wright knew that the only way forward was to face this truth head-on. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. He could fight for a world where his children, their children, would never have to fear the judgments of others, where love, no matter the color of the skin it was shared between, would be enough to protect them. And he would begin by acknowledging the truth that Lydia had carried alone for so long. He would fight for them, for their future, for the future of all children who had been hidden, who had been silenced, who had been forced to grow up in the shadows of a world that refused to see their humanity. It was time for the truth to be unveiled. Dr. Samuel Wright stood at the window, his gaze fixed on the sprawling cityscape below. The familiar sights, the bustling streets, the glass towers gleaming in the distance, felt distant now, like a different world. His mind was heavy, weighed down by the truth he had uncovered over the past few days. Everything he had known, everything he had believed about his life, had been turned upside down. His professional success, his carefully constructed identity, had been revealed for what it truly was, a shield that had protected him from the harsh realities of the world around him. A shield that had kept him blind to the struggles of those he loved. The weight of the past was suffocating, but as Dr. Wright stood there, he realized something: despite all the pain, despite the guilt and resentment that had consumed him, there was still a chance to change. There was still a chance to make things right. The truth had been laid bare. Lydia's sacrifice, her decision to protect their children from the world's hatred, had been driven by love. And now, with that truth in hand, Dr. Wright could no longer hide from the responsibility that was his, no longer pretend that he hadn't played a role in the life he had missed. The children he had never known, the family he had never been allowed to have, they were still here, still standing in front of him, waiting for him to act. For years, he had built his career, his life, on the illusion that success would shield him from the ugliness of the world. He had turned a blind eye to the systemic racism that had shaped his profession, his community, his very existence. But now, he could no longer deny the truth: his privilege had come at a cost. Lydia had been forced to bear that cost alone, to protect their children from a world that would have seen them as nothing more than a threat, a stain on a perfect image. She had kept them hidden, not out of malice, but out of love and fear. Now, it was his turn to take responsibility. The journey ahead would not be easy. Dr. Wright knew that. He had spent years distancing himself from the struggles of others, too focused on his career, on his reputation, to truly see the injustice that had been right in front of him. But now, as he thought about his children, their eyes filled with hope, with questions he couldn't yet answer, he knew that he had no choice but to step up. It wasn't just about being a father anymore. It was about being a man who was willing to face the harsh realities of the world and do something about it. It was about being willing to confront the systems of inequality that had kept him and his children apart, and to work, however long it took, to tear down those walls. Dr. Wright had always prided himself on his intelligence, on his ability to solve problems, to think through the complexities of life. But this was the hardest thing he had ever faced. It wasn't a medical diagnosis he could treat with a prescription or a surgery. It was a life, a future, that had been shaped by forces far beyond his control, and now it was his responsibility to change that future. To make sure that his children, and all children who had been born into the shadows of prejudice, could live in a world that saw them for who they truly were, human beings worthy of love, respect, and dignity. The decision wasn't easy. There was still a part of him that wanted to retreat, to hold on to the safety of his life as it had been before the truth had been unveiled, before he had learned the cost of his privilege. But as he thought about Lydia, about her love for him and their children, and about the sacrifices she had made, he knew that he could no longer live in the shadow of fear. He had to act. Dr. Wright turned away from the window, his resolve solidifying. He would start with the twins. He would be the father they deserved, the father who had never been there, but who now understood what it meant to fight for them, for their future. He would make sure they knew they were loved, that they had a place in this world, that their lives mattered. And, as he thought about the work ahead, Dr. Wright knew that this wasn't just about his children. It was about something far greater. It was about making amends, about finding redemption for the ways in which he had failed them, and for the ways he had failed himself. It was about taking responsibility for the world he had helped create, and doing everything in his power to change it. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he couldn't change the past, but he could change the present. And that, Dr. Wright realized, was the first step toward redemption. How do you think Dr. Wright should begin to make amends for the years he's lost with his children? What would be the first step in addressing the deep-rooted prejudice he's discovered in his life? If you enjoyed this chapter, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more of Dr. Wright's journey as he strives for redemption and responsibility in a world shaped by racial inequality.